and integrate officer availability in program management decisions, which was the subject of some of the Auditor General's, I thought, fair comments. The RCMP is continuing to work with communities to improve cultural awareness and practices as they reaffirm their commitment to keeping Indigenous communities safe, including through the First Nations and Inuit policing program. I have had reassuring and constructive conversations with the Commissioner, Mike Duhem, and I have a lot of confidence in the leadership of Assistant Commissioner Brown and Deputy Commissioner Larkin, who are with me today. Pour conclure, Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement du Canada continuera.
To conclude, the Government of Canada will continue to work with our partners and our law enforcement agencies, provinces and territories. Provinces and territories decide what their needs are when it comes to policing in their own jurisdictions, define the priorities of the program, and pay for 48% of the costs. The federal government then cost matches the remaining 52%. In doing this work, it is important that we respect the constitutional division of power, and that poses a challenge, of course, but not an insurmountable challenge.
To continue to work, Mr. Chair, obviously with Indigenous communities who rely on these services, and it's their security and their safety that should guide all these efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. And with that, we'll go into our first round of questioning, starting with Mr. Melillo for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. I guess we'll just start with an easy one right off the hop to get into this, Minister. Just a simple yes or no. Do you believe that First Nations policing is essential?
Yes, I do.
Okay. I appreciate that, Minister. I appreciate the answer. That's not something we get very often around here. But you say that you believe policing on First Nations is essential. You mentioned in your opening comments that the government is committed to tabling legislation. Unfortunately, this is something we've heard for a number of years now. Your predecessor, who was rightly removed from his position at the time in 2022, said that he was going to work around the clock to get this done. He said that it was right around the corner. This legislation would be here. And since then, we've seen delays. The government at one point began blaming the AFN for dragging its feet, which was a ridiculous assertion and an attempt to deflect from your government. But now you're the minister, and the buck stops with you. So why should Canadians and First Nations across the country believe you this time?
They should believe us because there has been a considerable body of work done in this respect. I referred to consultations that our Assistant Deputy Minister Morin has had and her colleagues have had across the country. These are ongoing conversations. As I said, I'm picking up the conversation with the National Chief later this afternoon. I don't underestimate the complexity of this initiative. I participated in a federal, provincial, and territorial meeting in Bromont, Quebec, with provincial and territorial ministers. They obviously have different views as to how this legislation might apply. As I noted, it's a constitutional jurisdiction they have, but that doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation to get it right. And I know the suspense has been terrible for you, but I think you should look forward to seeing legislation, I hope, in an appropriate moment soon.
Thank you, Minister. Again, I appreciate that. I want to stress again the urgency, because 2022, this is 2 years ago that your government's been dragging its feet. Since the commitment, of course, you've had 9 years in government, so ample opportunity to move this forward. I had an opportunity to speak with your Deputy Minister at a previous committee about this process, and he mentioned that it is, quote, simply the struggle of co-developing legislation. So, Minister, why is developing legislation in consultation with First Nations a struggle for your department?
I don't obviously think that working in a sensitive and appropriate way with First Nations partners is anything other than the appropriate way that we should be doing this work. My experience with the department is that exactly how they're approaching this work. And as I say, I have a lot of confidence.
So do you disagree with Mr. Tupper, your Deputy Minister? Do you disagree with his characterization that this is a struggle?
I would never seek to disagree with a Deputy Minister as senior and as experienced as Sean Tupper.
So you do believe that it is a struggle for your department to work and collaborate with First Nations.
No, that's the word you're using.
That's the word that your deputy minister used on the record in committee.
But if you want to ask the deputy minister a question, you can. What I'm happy to tell you is that it's work that we're committed to doing, and the deputy minister and our officials in the department are doing, I think, very constructive and positive work. And he and I and Chris and others are going to meet the national chief to continue this work in a little less than an hour from now.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. I'd like to move into some details of the report that you're here to discuss. Of course, there's lots that is concerning. For me, in northwestern Ontario, Treaty 3 territory captures most of my riding. And what's concerning in our local context is that Treaty 3, as well as two other police services in Ontario, have had to take the government to court. They are fighting for equal recognition, and all of this happening, such a important, essential service as policing is, and we see that your department anticipates over $45 million in program funds will be left undispersed at the end of this fiscal year. Why?
Mr. Chair, our colleague asked a number of questions, and
Just one question.
Well, there was a long preamble where you referenced some of the Northern Ontario work, and in fact, some of the police leadership that has most inspired me has been from Northern Ontario. So I have learned a great deal from some of the police leaders in your part of our country, and I think we should acknowledge that that is a part of the country that has seen considerable success, and we need to find a way to support them. With respect to the lapsing
I appreciate
of
that, Minister.
money,
I appreciate that, but
I was about to answer your question on the lapsing of money.
$45 million on the table. Why are you not spending this money?
So I was obviously, when I read the Auditor General's report, that was a source of concern to me. I discussed it with the senior RCMP leadership in the department right away. One of the challenges is this program is a cost-shared program. So our contribution comes at the end of the process, once provinces or territories allocate their own money. And in some cases, and I referred to that in my opening comments, in some cases it has to do with the RCMP's ability to staff a particular position in a particular community. So if that particular position is not able to be staffed, that's a separate challenge that we're making considerable progress in addressing, and I hope somebody asks us about recruitment and retention for some of these positions in Indigenous communities, because there's a good story to tell there. But you can see the challenge. The department is not able to allocate money to a particular position that is not filled, nor are we able to, under a contribution agreement, able to allocate money if a partner hasn't matched the 48%. So it's not, there should be zero money lapsed. So the way to get to zero money lapse, and we should increase the funding, which we're prepared to do, the way to do that is to work with provincial and territorial partners, and the RCMP improve the way they recruit and retain, which is well underway. So I'm confident that that number should be diminishing rapidly, but we do need to work with our policing partners in different jurisdictions to get that number to zero. I don't want to pretend that we alone have the ability to drive that number to zero, but we're going to work with them to get it to zero as quickly as we can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melillo. Moving on to our second questioner in the first round of the second panel is Mr. Pawlowski for 6 minutes.
Hello. We've heard you talk, Minister, about co-developing legislation to make First Nation policing an essential service. But we haven't really heard what's the significance of that. So maybe I could ask you, what is the significance and what does that mean, practically speaking, for providing good quality policing in Indigenous communities?
Mr. Chair, so through you to our colleague, Mr. Pawlowski, Dr. Pawlowski, thank you. Thank you for the question. And as Dr. Pawlowski noted, the designation of First Nations policing as an essential service, I think, confirms something that non-Indigenous communities have known for a very long time, that the ability to rely on professional, accessible, independent policing services is an essential requirement for communities to be safe, for communities to be able to grow, for families to be able to work and live in communities, and it should be no less so in Indigenous communities. But one of the things, and I learned this from representatives of policing services in Northern Ontario that is so ably represented by Dr. Pawlowski, what I learned is, imagine if you work for the Toronto Police Service, or heaven forfend the RCMP, Brian Larkin, and you didn't know on April 1st if you would have a paycheck, because it's a contribution agreement based on a certain number of fiscal years. Like, how do you train, recruit, maintain public confidence and the confidence of the officers who serve in these police forces if there isn't long-term, reliable, recurring funding? So the idea is to designate it as an essential service and provide legislative certainty as to the long-term, recurring nature of the funding. Because that will, and I learned this from police chiefs from Northern Ontario, be a lot easier for them to recruit and retain the kind of professional officers that they want to serve in their communities. And it speaks to the leadership in those communities being able to count on what is, as I said, in every other community, an essential service. So the idea that it sunsets with a contribution agreement wouldn't make sense in a non-Indigenous community. So we think it's a long overdue thing that we can correct, and we hope we can correct it legislatively. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And maybe you've partly responded or answered this question with that response, but I certainly know that they have trouble recruiting people to work in Indigenous communities. And having spoken to one police chief recently, it seems this is a common problem across Canada, both within Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. What are we doing in order to try to recruit more people into policing in general, but more particularly people to work in Indigenous communities?
So, Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, and Dr. Pawlowski, thank you for the question. It's a subject of conversations I've had with the leadership of the RCMP since I became the Public Safety Minister. But Assistant Commissioner Brown is in a great position, I think, to answer that based on his work. If it's okay, he might be able to give some more specific answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The RCMP, along with other police organizations nationally right now, are having a very challenging time recruiting anybody, period. With that, in 2023, we started a very robust recruiting program. We launched a First Nations, Inuit, and Métis recruiting strategy specific to those designations to help increase the number of applicants and increase candidate retention. The key objectives of this strategy include targeted marketing and outreach, reduction of barriers for applicants, and the provision of support for applicants. Our goal is to reach 10% Indigenous cadets to depot by the year 2027. So it's just been this year since the pandemic. We are now up to 40 troops. We anticipate, or certainly have a goal of getting to 50 troops with a full 32 allotment within those troops. I recently attended depot last week. It was the 30th year for the Indigenous Pre-Cadet Training Program, the IPTP. It was their anniversary. We had a full troop with that. Many of these young adults are wanting to work not only in their own home communities, but other Indigenous communities. We have our second IPTP troop starting in August. So I think we're on a really good pathway as it is right now. Overall, the RCMP, we have about 2,500 vacancies. That's about a 15% vacancy pattern across the board for frontline policing. In our Indigenous communities, however, out of the 1,823 Indigenous employees we have about a 7% vacancy. So again, I don't say that's good, but I think we're making some pretty good headway. So I'm really optimistic that in years to come, we'll have a really good news story for you. Thank you.
Any consideration of recruiting specifically from the Rangers program? We've spoken to a number of Rangers. It's certainly a group which impressed me and seemed to be a potentially good pool for policing services.
Funny you should ask that question. One of the IPTP cadets, his brother attended for his graduation and was a graduate of that program, so he and I had a discussion, but I think that along with other initiatives we have locally in communities, including our Indigenous communities, are well underway.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pulowski. Après vous, on a Mr.
And the next speaker is Mr. Lemire, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Just one moment.
Ma lumière, le microphone ne se connecte pas.
My microphone doesn't seem to be connecting. Mr. Lemire, we can hear you. Yes, I know. I just want to make sure that the sound is going through my headset. Thank you, Minister, for your presentation. I was happy to hear the Conservatives' question, but the timeline is getting very tight, and obviously the bill is taking a while to materialize. So if ever there's a change of government, are you worried that everything you've done will lead to naught?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Lemire, for the question. It won't surprise you that I don't share the pessimism that you have about a change of government. Now, I'm not pessimistic because when it comes to supporting Indigenous peoples, well, I do understand the sentiment. Obviously, I'm teasing here, but I would have used the parliamentary calendar with an election at the latest in 12 months. So there could be an election at that point. So I'm very much aware of the timeline here. It is at the base of my conversation with the chief that will take place later today. I understand the goal of having a bill that defines funding and that has recurring funding, but obviously I understand, Mr. Lemire, you're very interested in issues of jurisdiction. And the truth is that it really is a challenge to find a way to pass laws here in the Parliament of Canada, but respect jurisdiction of provinces that are in charge of policing services. But I am very optimistic about my conversations with my counterpart in Quebec. The Sûreté du Québec is also extremely interested in collaborating with us, and so I'm hopeful, but of course we have to find a way of respecting the general objective, but doesn't put us in a situation where we'll find ourselves before the courts because we tried to infringe on provincial jurisdiction. So obviously you might think that we're not sensitive enough about it. I'll be honest with you, Minister. What I'm hearing on the ground is that there's a lot of discussion between the federal government and the provincial government on building these police forces, but there's not enough discussion with the Indigenous communities. First Nations want to know what's going on with the bill. We know that the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls called for several actions to be taken. Minister Haidu talked about the importance of dealing with all of these issues, but the main thing here is, when will the bill be tabled? When will these services be recognized as essential services and then receive the funding as a consequence? This is a discussion that we have in my own riding. It is something extremely important for the community in Long Point, among others, that no longer has a police service. So we want to know when this is going to translate into concrete action. Thank you for the question. And I heard similar encouraging comments about the will in your region, Témiscamingue, to train Indigenous police forces. So that is exactly what we hope to include in a bill. I don't want your Conservative colleague to come back to my predecessor's plans. We had a very ambitious timeline and we were not able to respect it. I'm very well aware, as you raised, of the parliamentary calendar, and I hope that there will be a positive development after my discussion with the Grand Chief today. And I think my colleagues are on the same page as me. Thank you. Minister Leblanc, I know you have a lot of political weight. I invite you to really make this a priority. If you look at C-38, C-61, other bills, Indigenous bills are not the priority of the government, but this needs to be a priority. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
We have Ms. Idlout for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all of you that you will be leaving soon and you didn't have much time, so thanks for warning us. I'd like to ask, according to the Auditor General's report, that only 38% of the communities in this program had a dedicated officer on site. The term of the program requires 100% capacity. Why is the RCMP not meeting its obligations? We are. Okay. I will repeat. According to the Auditor General's report, only 38% of the community.
Ça fonctionne très bien en français, Monsieur le Président, pour répondre à la...
It works very well. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Idlout, it seems to be working. You can continue.
Do I repeat the question? Okay.
I will repeat the question. According to the Auditor General's report, only 38% of the communities are participating in this program. Only 38% of the communities had a dedicated officer on site. The term of the program requires 100%. Why is the RCMP not meeting its obligations?
Chair, thank you for the question, and to Ms. Idlout, thank you for the question. That was also one of the things when I spoke to the Auditor General and when I read the report that was obviously a source of concern, as it would be for you and the people that you represent and other colleagues represent. There has been, and if in order to provide reliable, precise information, because I understand the importance for the communities, perhaps Assistant Commissioner Brown could provide some precision. The good news is at the time, so there are 443 positions contemplated in this agreement. At the time of the audit, there were 60 vacancies. That number has been cut in half, so it's down to 30. It should be 0. And we're working to get there, but perhaps Assistant Commissioner Brown could provide some specific answers to the precise communities that you're referring to where there were vacancies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. This is a very complex matter whereby the provinces and the territories are responsible for the administration of the police. I noted in the Auditor General's report This is clearly work that the RCMP need to improve upon, and we intend to do that with our counterparts at Public Safety Canada. We're not a signatory to the community tripartite agreements, and it's our experience in some communities, there's perhaps not a great understanding of what enhanced policing is versus core policing. We would welcome the opportunity of the RCMP to be part of that table when CTAs or community tripartite agreements are renewed. As the Minister responded, out of the 146 CTAs, community tripartite agreements we have nationally with 443 members, we're seeing significant vacancies in other areas as well. So unfortunately, oftentimes when there's limited numbers of members in small remote communities, they have to provide a core policing function as well. So they're not adhering to 100% of their policing time. So we have to get better at that. So we've agreed with the Auditor General on that. However, with the optimistic and robust approach we have for recruiting, I believe that we can meet that measure in short time.
Thank you. Last question. You responded to my last question. I just want to remind everyone in Nunavut, our police are not present in every community, and it affects us in the community, in the territory. Pangnato, for instance, and Talodjok, and Nauyat, and Iqaluit. Those communities have headquarters. They start work at 8:30 and they complete the day at 4:30. When they are given a call after hours, they will respond. But in the evening after hours, after 4:30, in the evening until the next morning, if you call for the RCMP, nobody will not respond. Your call will be directed to the Iqaluit headquarters. Once your call is directed to the headquarters in Iqaluit, the recipient does not speak Inuktitut and does not understand the caller. Many people are appreciative that we have policing for safety, but their hours do not serve the community 24/7 as they should. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, Ms. Idlout, thank you for raising that issue. It's obviously very concerning. I'm happy to work with the leadership of the RCMP to see what we can do and work with you to ensure that that circumstance is mitigated and corrected. I'm encouraged by conversations I've had with the Premier of Nunavut. We have discussed I'm also the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, so I have the opportunity in that function to talk to the territorial premiers, and I remember very clearly the desire of the government of Nunavut to work with the RCMP. The RCMP has a footprint in many parts, not all parts, as you noted, of your vast territory. But if there are ways that we can work to ensure that that footprint is more effective, and I'm obviously particularly sensitive to the linguistic piece that you raised, and I'm happy to ensure that we follow up directly with you and ensure that we speak directly to the communities you identified as well.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. We are now moving on to our second round. And first, for 5 minutes, we have Mr. Shields. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here today. Minister, you've got a long history in working with government, so here's a couple of questions for you. The length of the tripart agreement, do you know the length of that agreement that's currently in place?
My understanding is they vary from different communities, so I don't...
I'm talking about the one that you and I know in our provinces, the tripart agreement. How long is that agreement? How many years?
The framework agreement is a 10-year agreement, but there are different... Is that your question? I want to make sure...
The tripart agreement that the provinces sign with the feds Should be an easy answer. Should be. It's 20 years. I was at the table when that was negotiated the last time in 2012. That's a 20-year agreement you're talking about.
Sorry, I was just told by the Assistant Deputy Minister it's 5 years plus 5 years, but I think we should, I don't want to leave confusion at the table, perhaps, but we're happy to come back to that exact agreement with you. I don't want to leave...
Because it expires in 2032. It was negotiated and went into effect in 2012. It expires in 2032.
Maybe, Mr. Chair, and if we're talking about the contract policing, apologize. I thought you were talking about the contribution agreements with respect to First Nations and Inuit policing. The contract policing, you're absolutely right, expires in 2032.
And that's 48.52%, which goes to cover Indigenous people in a lot of provinces.
Again, I don't think that's accurate, but perhaps...
You've referred to it a number of times here today already.
But that wasn't the contract policing that we sign with provincial governments to provide contract. That's the First Nations and Inuit policing program, which is separate from the contract policing program we have with...
I'm going to go back to that. It's a 20-year agreement that you and I have our policing through. So when we talk about Indigenous self-administered, what percent of those contracts are 1 year? Your self-administered policing contracts you're talking about, what percent are 1 year?
Again, I can't imagine this is deliberate, but there's a significant, certainly, confusion, I think, at this end of the table in terms of the agreements with provinces and territories to provide contract policing services like in the city of Moncton where I have a house.
Right.
And then there's the First Nations and Inuit policing program. That's the 4852 cost sharing.
Yes, got that. As you said, we're moving into the other one, the one that you've made with Indigenous. When we're talking about self-administered, what's the length of those contracts?
Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, I think the Assistant Deputy Minister might ensure that we all have a common basis of understanding with respect to these different contracts.
Thank you, Minister. There are two types of contracts under the First Nations Policing Agreement. There is a framework agreement with each of the provinces that FNIPP operates in, and those have, under the framework agreement, there are community tripartite agreements. But with respect to the self-administered police services, of which we have 36, those are separate agreements with provinces, the First Nation, and the federal government.
How long are those contracts?
Those contracts vary. They can be as long as 10 years, but it is at the discretion of the First Nation. So some of them, in fact, are 1 year.
Same as I was asking before. I asked how many are at 1 year, how many at 5, how many are at 10, and that's what I was looking for. Because we've got the main one we're talking about, you and I, we have 20 years in that contract, but we have none 20 years in those 38 agreements. Why?
So, perhaps, Mr. Chair, and it's a very good question, perhaps, Mr. Chair, I'll ask the department to come back to you with the exact number of years for the individual agreements, just so everybody has that information. But I think our colleague has identified, Mr. Chair, exactly the challenge that I tried to describe in my opening comments, because I think the point is absolutely valid. If in the contract policing between the province of New Brunswick and the Government of Canada, or a municipal police force that has the City of Toronto, SPVM, pick your municipal police force, that goes on year over year, that is the essential element that is not fair to the Indigenous policing communities, and that's exactly the issue that we're trying to address. So I think I share entirely our colleague's concern.
You've got it. What I'm getting back from those Indigenous leaders is that you won't give them the 20 years. They're telling me you won't go to 20 years. You're saying you're negotiating, that's their term. They're telling me you won't go there.
Again, there's a whole series of different contracts.
I got that, but I'm getting pushback from Indigenous chiefs saying you won't go to 20 years like you and I have. You won't go there.
And, well, that's exactly why, Mr. Chair, we think that it would be important to have the designation of essential services and the long-term funding, which it might be a 10-year agreement, renewable for 10 years, there's your 20 years, but they would know that their police services won't disappear, and they'll be in perpetuity like in a municipality or our friends at the RCMP. So I share that concern.
Good. I have sat in phone conversations when the bureaucracy with chiefs, they didn't know I was there. They're pushing hard. I'm hearing the bureaucrats say no. So I hear that on phone conversations in person. I'm on. The bureaucrats don't know I'm there. The chiefs know I'm there, and that's why I'm there. Your guys are not going there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shields. And Minister, if you could actually submit that information to the committee on those 36 agreements, I think that would be very helpful. But with that, we're moving on to our second questioner in the second round, Mr. McLeod, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister and his team that are here to talk to about Indigenous policing. It's a very important issue across the country, but in the riding that I represent, it's significant. We have 33 communities in Northwest Territories, and 12 of them don't have any police. So I don't believe those would be listed as vacant positions under your statistics, because there is no police. And the concern is that's being conveyed to me is that it's putting the leadership, who by default become the peacekeepers in the communities because there's nobody else there. It's putting them in serious, sometimes very dangerous predicaments. And I wanted to ask you to explain why no community in the Northwest Territories or Nunavut has signed a tripartite agreement to receive enhanced police services under the program.
Mr. Chair, so through you to Mr. McLeod, thank you for the question. And in a conversation you and I had some months ago, Mr. McLeod, I was surprised and, in fact, discussed with the RCMP, and in a subsequent conversation with your Premier, who has kept some of this responsibility for himself. I thought that was interesting in my discussions with the new Premier, the importance of working with his government. He echoed exactly the concern, Mr. McLeod, that you just shared with us around these communities that do not have specific police resources assigned to them. It is, as the Assistant Commissioner noted, a challenge across the country, but it's not one that should excuse a lack of police presence in communities that are in many cases isolated and would require that basic element of public safety. I don't know if Deputy Commissioner Larkin or Assistant Commissioner Brown can speak to the specific tripartite agreements in the Northwest Territories. Perhaps Assistant Commissioner Brown has that specific answer for Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Chair, and thank you for that question. I don't want to volley this back to our colleagues at Public Safety Canada. However, the RCMP is responsible for providing contract policing to a specific province or territory. Presently, we are working with Public Safety Canada, I believe, in a consultation phase. I'm not aware if we do have any CTA positions presently in the territories, but I'm hoping that we may get there. But I'm not aware of any detachment that is not staffed.
Okay. I'm going to interrupt you. Obviously, you're not getting to what I'm talking about. We seem to have a challenge in the Northern Territories about trying to have Indigenous policing into the territories. When I raised the question with the territorial government, they say they don't have the resources to cost share either RCMP or Indigenous police. And when I talk to the federal government, and you're the third minister I'm talking to, the response has always been there is no enabling legislation. Actually, I'm very disappointed that we're still taking this colonial attitude where we have to have the Indigenous government go to a third party for public safety. Why are we not engaging with Indigenous governments to set up policing programs when we have resources at the federal level, but we have no partners to take it on because the provinces in some cases, and in my situation, the territorial government doesn't have the resources to cost share. Why aren't we discussing this as a possibility for Indigenous governments to engage?
Mr. Chair, that's exactly what our objective would be, to have Indigenous governments and Indigenous partners lead the establishment and the maintenance of these police services. The challenge and this was my conversation with the Northern Premiers, the challenge is the provision of RCMP services, as the Assistant Commissioner noted, is subject to the contract that we would have with the government of the Northwest Territories. And they, in terms of allocating police resources in the territory, this is a constant challenge. They're correct. I see Mr. McLeod smiling. They're correct to identify the lack of funding as a concern.
I have to interrupt you because
Mr. McLeod, I'm afraid your time
it's
is...
become a hot potato, and I hear you what you're saying. It's territorial government. Territorial government says it's you. Where does it end? Do communities have to declare a state of emergency before somebody will engage? There is no policing.
And I take your point, Mr. McLeod and Mr. Chair. I know we're out of time. I know in no way would I seek to pass the hot potato to the new Premier, with whom I had a very positive discussion. We got increased funding for Indigenous police services in the last budget. I committed to working with the Premier of the Northwest Territories and the RCMP leadership into finding the best way to deal with what, at the very root of your question, is a circumstance that should worry all of us.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. Next, we are moving to Monsieur Lemire pour 2 minutes et demie.
2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Minister, for over 5 years, we've been waiting for developments with this bill. Is there a link between the Auditor General's report, the fact that you have been invited here at INAN, and the fact that you're meeting this afternoon with the Grand Chief? Mr. Lemire, I've already had discussions with the National Chief. I know that the Deputy Minister met with her a few months ago. I met her for the first time last fall in Winnipeg. So I understand the urgency of the situation. I accept it and recognize that this is not simple. If it were simple, then I think my predecessors would have closed this file already. But I do recognize the urgency, whether it's your region or Mr. McLeod's region, the Northwest Territories, or elsewhere. So I'm continuing my work, and I hope to move forward as much as possible and as quickly as possible. The expectations are very clear when it comes to First Nations. We want there to be more transparency. C61 about water was very much appreciated because it was co-created with Indigenous peoples. Is there something similar going on with this bill in order to really recognize Indigenous police services as an essential service? Once again, that's an excellent question. And the example of water is one that we should look at as an example. Yes, we have engaged in discussion with the Assembly of First Nations to co-develop the bill. The issue of inherent rights and the recognition of an essential service is a challenge for us. Some people have suggested that we should recognize the inherent right to police services, and of course you will understand, as I do, that comes up against constitutional issues that are very difficult to resolve. So I want to work with the First Nations and be inspired by the excellent example that you raised, but of course that doesn't stop us from continuing to work on this in good faith. Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
Questioner of the second panel here, Ms. Idlout, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to I want to, as I read the report, I hear and read that the police have no cultural training or cross-cultural training. They have no idea about Indigenous lifestyles, and they are not trauma-informed. So my question will be something like, the Auditor General's report found that RCMPs did not get neither cultural or trauma-informed training. Learning this, what changes will be made to ensure that both cultural-specific and trauma-informed training is provided to the RCMP?
For that question, and I too read that, and in my conversations directly with the Auditor General, discussed that very issue with her. I am, and the Assistant Commissioner identified some of the Indigenous troops that are going through Depot now. In my visit to Depot last fall, and in my conversations both with officials of the Public Safety Department and the leadership of the RCMP, I think that circumstance has been very significantly improved. I think that we can always continue to do better and to do more. But my conversations with both the Commissioner and my colleagues who are here today tell me that there are very specific training programs currently in place where not only obviously Indigenous members joining the RCMP, but all members who would serve in Canada's National Police Force would benefit from that culturally appropriate training and understanding. And maybe the Assistant Commissioner can provide some precise detail. I take the question in the earnestness in which it was posed, and certainly commit our government to ensuring that that is not a recurring circumstance. But I'm optimistic by the work that's been done, but the Assistant Commissioner can perhaps provide more specific reassurance than my words.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. We've just hired our first Inuit cadet will be attending Depot this month, and that's the first Inuit member we've hired in the past decade. We've just hired 2 operators in our dispatch center you spoke about earlier in Iqaluit who speak Inuktitut, as well as all front counter staff at Iqaluit detachment as well speak Inuktitut. We have a 40-hour training regime at Depot for all RCMP cadets for Indigenous studies. That includes the blanket exercise, but I was part of the very first training exercise last week where we now have a floor map journey. That's a more comprehensive lived experience for not only Inuit, First Nation and Métis people for significant dates and impact the RCMP have had. So I would suggest that, albeit we're not there, we're certainly getting there. The Management Action Board as well.
I'm afraid we're ran out of time here. But thank you very much, and thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. And with that, that concludes our second panel. I do want to thank Minister LeBlanc for appearing today, as well as officials from Public Safety and the RCMP. I know, Minister, you need to make it to a very important meeting, but thank you again for being here today. And with that, we're going to briefly suspend before we go in camera to do some committee business.